This video is about a curious artefact that I first set eyes on in September of 1995, when as a fresh-faced first-year undergraduate I started reading for a degree in history at University College London. I was already morbidly interested in the macabre, and I was instantly fascinated, and I might add, a little repelled by what I saw. The artefact is a full figure of an elderly gentleman called Jeremy Bentham, who died in 1832 at the age of 84. When I first saw him in 1995, he was in a glass-fronted mahogany cabinet, seated on a chair beside a little writing table. He was dressed in a dark suit with a cravat, with a broad-brimmed straw hat on his head, and he held in his gloved hands his walking cane. He sat there in silence and stillness, gazing out at all who passed by. When I was a student, in the mid-90s, the figure was in an area of UCL called the South Cloisters, and I walked past it daily as I was heading from my digs towards the history department in Gordon Square. I understand that it has since been conserved and moved, and has now been removed from the original mahogany case and is in a glass case in the brand spanking new student centre. The case and figure are not dissimilar in form and feel, and perhaps in their shock value, to the wax effigy of Sarah Hare that I showed you in an earlier video, though I think that Jeremy Bentham is a little more benign looking than Sarah. But unlike Sarah, this figure is not simply a representation of Jeremy Bentham. It is Jeremy Bentham himself, for inside the figure is his entire skeleton, less his head. And the figure is, to use a term that Bentham coined himself, an auto-icon. In this video, I want to tell you a little bit about Jeremy Bentham and his rather unconventional ideas, why his mortal remains were treated in this bizarre manner, and why his auto-icon is at UCL. I've just launched my new website. Do go and have a look. There's a link above. On there you can learn a little more about who I am and what I do. You can subscribe to my beautiful and history-packed monthly magazine, The Antiquary. You can buy back issues of the magazine, and you can read my blog. The new website allows me to offer magazine subscribers much more than I could before, including exclusive blog and video content. If you've not subscribed, why not consider it? Subscribing to the magazine helps support this channel. So who was Jeremy Bentham? Well, he was a well-known intellectual in the late 18th and early 19th century. He was a philosopher, a thinker and a writer, a radical who had ideas that were very much out of step with many of the ideas of the age he lived in. He was a rationalist and a utilitarian. He believed that morality should be based on the principle of utility and the greatest happiness principle, that pain and pleasure should be the major guide to morals. He was an advocate of the abolition of slavery at a time when it was unfashionable to be opposed to it, and was a critic of Britain's imperial expansion. He was an active penal reformer who saw no good in capital or corporal punishment and created a theoretical system for the reform of prisoners. He supported equality between the sexes and women's rights of universal suffrage, and was an advocate of the decriminalisation of the homosexuality. He was also a proponent, as a utilitarian, of animal rights. Education in the early 19th century was controlled by the Church of England, the established church, and to receive a university education in this country one had to be a communicant member of the Church of England. Bentham was critical of this, and he threw his support and influence, though he wasn't directly involved in the foundation, behind a plan to establish a new university in London that would be open to all regardless of their religious affiliation. This new university, established in 1826 as London University, became in time University College London, UCL. Towards the end of his life, his utilitarian ideas led him to become a rather militant atheist, which wasn't a socially acceptable position to hold then. Interested in religion from an anthropological point of view, he believed that religious revelation was a poor basis for morality and law. And that brings us to the issue of his body and its disposal, and the morality of the treatment and use of the dead, and whether it was moral for the dead to serve the living. In the early 19th century, the English had a very conservative view about the disposal of the dead. Everyone was buried. The bodies of the rich were buried in elaborate 3-part coffins lined with lead, often within church buildings. Funerals were generally expensive, accompanied by a panoply of tradition, and were big business for the undertakers and the Church of England, which of course had a virtual monopoly on all burials. Conversely, it had long been recognised that the dissection of the corpses of the dead benefited the medical profession and brought forward advances in medicine and science. But the use of bodies for medical science conflicted with these conservative values. It was illegal for an individual to give their own body to an anatomist for dissection. The only ready supply of corpses for medical schools were those of condemned criminals. Before 1752, only murderers' corpses could be used, and this was considered morally acceptable given that they had taken a life. After 1752, there were so few corpses available to the anatomists that it became permissible for any capital offence to have attached to it by a judge a sentence of execution followed by public dissection. In the early 19th century, with penal reform, many former capital offences were then commuted to transportation for life, and fewer corpses of executed criminals were available for use. Some unscrupulous individuals tried to profit from this short supply by digging up the corpses of the recently deceased from cemeteries and graveyards and selling them to medical schools. But body snatching was illegal. Any so-called resurrection men caught with a shovel in a graveyard at night could be condemned to execution and dissection themselves. In 1828, 2 Edinburgh men, Burke and Hare, were caught not only stealing corpses from graveyards, but murdering people to order for the anatomists, and they were executed and then dissected themselves. Utilitarians like Jeremy Bentham were pushing for a change to all this law to ensure such scandals did not occur again, and that more corpses became available for the anatomy schools. And they were prepared to involve themselves in direct action to bring this about. Bentham first contemplated giving his body to medical science as far back as 1769 when he was in his early 20s, and he had agreed, should he die, to give his body to a friend, Dr. Fordyce, so that it might be dissected. As the years rolled on, his ideas formulated further into what he eventually termed his auto-icon project. By 1820 his plan seems to have been well formed, and notes survive among his papers in which he considers the legal implications of his plan. The plan appears to have been laid down in its final form in April of 1830. In May of 1832, a month before he died, Bentham made his will, and he implemented the plan of 1830 in it. He directs the disposal of his body and appends to the will the April 1830 document that provides minute details on how he wishes his corpse to be disposed of. Alongside formulating these plans, at the same time he is busy writing a treatise that is a philosophical and moral justification for his action, entitled Auto-Icon, or the Uses of the Dead to the Living. He bequeaths his body to his friend Dr. Thomas Southwood Smith, who was a fellow advocate of anatomy reform. Bentham directs that Southwood Smith should use his body as the means of illustrating a series of lectures, which were to expound the situation, structure and functions, and to illustrate the mechanism by which the actions of the animal economy are performed. Southwood Smith was to do this through dissection, and the purpose of the work was to communicate curious, interesting and highly important knowledge. The dissection was also intended to influence others in the cause of liberalising anatomy law. The dissection was not to be public, but was in front of an invited audience of scientific and literary men, so that they would come to know that the primitive horror, he calls it, of dissection is but a response of ignorance, and that the human body, when dissected, instead of being an object of disgust, is as much more beautiful than any other piece of mechanism. The dissection began with a narration by Southwood Smith on anatomy reform, followed by a dissection of Bentham's body and a lecture, and it took place on the afternoon of the 3rd of June 1832. Bentham instructed in his will that after the dissection, Dr. Southwood Smith was to preserve organs which are capable of being preserved, for example the heart and the kidney, so that they would be available for further study and teaching. His head and his bones are then to be preserved as the auto-icon, and Bentham is very clear about how that auto-icon must be presented. He is to be presented in death as the intellectual he was in life. The auto-icon was to be put together in such a manner as that the whole figure may be seated in a chair. Bentham even chose the chair. It was to be the one he usually occupied when living. He was to be placed in the chair in the attitude in which I am sitting when engaged in thought in the course of time employed in writing. Southwood Smith is directed to cause the skeleton to be clad in one of the suits of black occasionally worn by Bentham, and he was to be holding his walking stick, which apparently Bentham called Dapple. It's perfectly normal, isn't it, to give a name to your walking stick. It's not in the least eccentric. The whole auto-icon was then to be placed in an appropriate box or case, with Bentham's name engraved in conspicuous characters on a plate to be affixed thereon. The soft tissues and organ samples that were preserved by Southwood Smith separately were to be similarly labelled. I'm not sure if any of these samples survive. All of these requests were carried out to the letter. The skeleton of Bentham was wired together with copper wire so that it could be articulated and then placed inside the chosen clothing, which was then stuffed with hay and cotton wool to fill out Bentham's form. Bentham's head received a very different treatment than the rest of his body. It was detached, and it was preserved by Southwood Smith through desiccation, using an air pump over a bath of sulphuric acid. Bentham had been fascinated by the Maori practice of creating mummified. Joseph Banks, the botanist on Captain Cook's expedition to New Zealand, who was an acquaintance of Bentham, returned home in 1771 with one of these preserved heads, a preserved head of a mummified of a Maori boy, and this led to a trade in them over the succeeding years. In 1824, a friend of Bentham's, John Bowring, wrote that Bentham was full of the idea of having his own head preserved, like the New Zealanders' mummified, and that he had asked his friend, Dr. John Armstrong, to advise him on how this might be achieved, and that Armstrong was to get a head from his colleague, the anatomist Edward Granger, in order to experiment on it. The drying process that Southwood Smith undertook removed any expression or any of the facial features from Bentham's head, though it did preserve his skin and his grey shoulder-length hair. With its blue glass eyes staring out, the result is rather startling and grotesque. The intention was that the head would sit atop the auto-icon, and it was fitted on a spike to allow that, but Southwood Smith rather wisely decided against it. Instead, the head was placed inside the body cavity of the auto-icon for many years, and that is where it remained until 1898. In 1898, the auto icon was cleaned and then the head was removed and was placed between Bentham's legs in the mahogany case. But then in 1948, a special box was made for it. And in 1975, it was put away from view in the college strong room. You need a strong stomach to look at it, and apparently to smell it too. As it's not tanned, it has something of the odour of raw hide. Lovely. When it became obvious that Bentham's real head could not be affixed to the auto icon, Southwood Smith commissioned a lifelike wax head to be made by a skilled French artist called Jacques Talriche, who based it on a painting and also a bust of Bentham, and it was an admirable likeness. So how did the auto icon end up in University College London, my alma mater? Well, it remained with Southwood Smith for 20 years, firstly at his residence in New Broad Street and then later at 38 Finsbury Square. Various people saw him there, including Charles Dickens, who was a friend of Southwood Smith, and there is evidence that Bentham's auto icon was on at least one occasion brought out to dine with Southwood Smith's guests, as he had requested. In 1850, Southwood Smith retired and gave up Finsbury Square, and it was at this point that the auto icon was offered to Bentham's fellow reformer and friend Lord Brougham, who was one of the founders of UCL, and it came to the college. There are lots of legends and stories attached to it. One of them is that the auto icon attends meetings of the UCL College Council and that its presence is recorded in the minutes. Jeremy Bentham, present but not voting. There's also a persistent rumour that Bentham has on occasion cast a deciding vote at the council, always voting for the motion proposed. None of this is remotely true. What is true is that Jeremy Bentham's head was stolen in 1975 by students from UCL's rival King's College London. They demanded a ransom of £100 paid to a charity. Eventually, the college agreed to pay £10 and the head was returned, and it was at this point that it was put into secure storage. Of course, this story has been mythologized, and I remember some of these stories circulating when I was a student. There is a version that says that students from King's were found playing football with Jeremy's head in the front quadrangle of the college, and another that when stolen the head had to be retrieved from a left luggage locker at a Scottish railway station. It is churlish to let the truth get in the way of a good yarn. On a serious note, of course, in June of 1832, when Bentham died, his expressed wishes were still against the law. So Bentham is at pains to make it clear in his will that Southwood Smith had not been present when he'd written his will, nor had he influenced his decision. But as Bentham lay dying in his house in Queen Square Place, now under the site of the Ministry of Justice, a new Anatomy Act was working its way through Parliament, and it was given royal assent a few months after Bentham died in August of 1832. It proposed that people could bequeath their bodies for dissection, as he had done, or that a next of kin could give the body of a relative to an anatomy school, so long as the school then paid for the subsequent burial afterwards. However, this act went chillingly much further than Bentham and Southwood Smith were comfortable with. It also gave the anatomy schools the power to claim for dissection any corpse that went unclaimed by a next of kin. There was a ready supply of corpses of the poor and destitute from workhouses, where quite often relatives didn't claim the corpse of their loved one because they couldn't afford to provide for a proper burial. It was utterly disgraceful and went against all of Bentham's utilitarian principles, and in this matter his ideas were in harmony with the Church. The Church of England objected to this hideous aspect of the Act, and there was an uproar at the time about this cruel provision, but it would remain on the statute book until the 1980s. Thanks very much for watching.